Welcome to another episode of Courageous Conversations Live. I'm your host, Pierre Quinn, and here on Courageous Conversations, we're leveraging the stories of creatives, of leaders, of entrepreneurs to help you live and lead with greater courage. Joining me on this episode, my special guest is Terry Grimm. Terry, thanks for being my guest today.
Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate being here.
I know we're going to have a wonderful conversation just right after our housekeeping items. So if you're hanging out with us, we'd love to give you a shout out here on Courageous Conversations. Go ahead and drop in the comment section and let us know you're hanging out with us on LinkedIn. Might even have some folks hanging out on Facebook and YouTube as well. If you got a question for Terry, our theme for this conversation is Think Like a Futurist. So you got a question for Terry, go ahead and drop that in and feel free to hit that share button so more leaders can experience this conversation as well. All right. So Terry, want to start off. How did you develop an interest in computer science? Of all the college majors, of all the paths you can go down, why computer science?
Well, that's an interesting question. I discovered computer science in the early 70s. Yes, it does mean I'm old. Back when we did things on punch cards. I always loved math and science. And if you think about it, I started college in 1971 when women weren't really allowed in math and science. I was told to be a nurse or a math teacher, which I didn't want to do. And I stumbled into an elective called computer science. And it was a lot of fun. And I thought, this is what I want to major in. So I was one of 3 women to get a degree in computer science back in the early 70s. And it turned out to be an amazing career. And I was able to really leverage my knowledge and experience working in the space program for over 20 years.
So when you look at the landscape today, and there's a lot of push and coming from several different directions to give opportunities for women in the sciences versus how things were when you started. What are the feelings that come up when you think about all of these programs for STEM and STEAM and giving young girls the opportunity to pursue and not necessarily having to settle for things that they don't feel like they really have an interest in?
I think it's fantastic. In fact, I would be a big push for women and young girls to even get really active in things like video games and a lot of science fiction and that kind of stuff, because boys get an edge. You know, they're playing with computers. They learn how to build computers at a young age, you know, and so it needs to start really young. But it's really great to see lots of women in the engineering and STEM field. I mean, it's really wonderful.
What were your experiences like at IBM and the amazing things that you've done with the space program? Were there some tensions you faced, even reminders of, okay, you're a woman in this space? And how did you not let those things stand in your way? Because you have had an amazing career at IBM.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, IBM has been always a big advocate for women and continues to be for, you know, all different people. I can't say enough good about how IBM was a great place to land. You know, what you encountered were, you know, people from different companies. You know, they would see you in the hallway and ask you to make a broadcast or an announcement. You'd go, you need to find a secretary. You know, and they'd look at you and you'd go, no, I'm not. And IBM let me advance in the engineering and stuff. So lots of good things there. And I see a lot of women in the space programs today. Mm-hmm. And it's great to have women astronauts and, you know, women on flight crew centers and all of that. It's just really great.
There's this theme in your life, and you mentioned it before, how an undergrad you took this class in computer science, and it really just changed your world and opened up your mind to some different things. When you're in a grad program, you were in a grad program several years later, and you took another class. that kind of just open up your world. I know we talked about it in a previous conversation, but I think it would be helpful for people to hear as we're sharing that other class you took and how it really just shifted your really the trajectory of your life.
Yeah, there is a lot of similarity. Well, I did my bachelor's in comp sci and did my master's in comp sci, but I decided to go back to school at a certain point in my career, and I started at the traditional, let's go get an MBA. And I went through one or two courses and went, this is really boring. I can do it, but it's boring. And so I randomly signed up for a class in media. And it was like one of those classes that you couldn't wait to get to every week. You know, the discussion was so invigorating and imaginative. And I finally said, well, what degree is this in? And they said, oh, this is studies of the future. And I went, this is my degree. And so I switched it. And I guess, you know, to your audience, the message I have is always just follow your heart. I mean, you can tell when things are a match for you, you know, so don't follow what everybody says, like, you know, get an MBA, you know, because you know, everybody all along told me my degrees were wrong for me. I had to fight with my father when I switched my major from math to computer science, because back then he couldn't imagine that you could get a job in computer science. And he thought that was about the stupidest degree there was. You know, and studies of the future still has skeptics, but I've had, you know, 10, 15 years working as a futurist, and I can't think of a better activity. I love it. So, yeah, I think it's just following where your heart leads you.
We got a couple of people hanging out with us on LinkedIn. Antonio Lennon, the leadership coach, is checking in, as well as Miguel Serrant. And Miguel says he never really thought about the lack of diversity in the gaming and tech space. So we thank you for highlighting that, and even the push, because like you said before, I have two daughters, and there's not always the push, hey, for girls, hey, play video games, hey, experiment, hey, pull things apart. So my youngest daughter, I bought her a tool set, and I said, anything you want to pull apart, put it back together, but you can pull it apart. So it's encouraging to hear that from you. Now, Miguel also says studies of the future. I've never heard of it, but that sounds amazing. So when people say to you, studies of the future, what's that about? How do you typically respond? Because I'm sure you get that question fairly often.
Well, first of all, you can get a master's in studies of the future in several universities. University of Houston, where I graduated and actually taught in, has a master's. If you want to go somewhere with lots of sun and all sorts of excitement, University of Hawaii. And then there's a lot of international programs as well. And they're in different programs involved. But studies of the future teaches you some systematic way of looking at the future, which we don't do. So it's learning methods and approaches. And actually there's content courses as well, but it's focused on how do we look better at the future so that we can make better decisions. People sometimes think it's so you can predict and be right, but that's not what it's about at all. One, you cannot control enough variables to guarantee anything. And two is we don't like to say predict, because that assumes the future is predetermined. What we're about is being able to influence the future in the direction that you want it to be influenced. And so it's just learning approaches. I find that it's a lot easier when I run into skeptics to tell them that my first career was an engineer in the space program. And so I've got some street credits, that it's not like I'm some flake somewhere, you know, saying, oh, let's think about this. And that's been an advantage for me. But it really is a more systematic way of looking at the future, smarter and opening up options. And it's something we desperately, desperately need in today's challenges. And that's why I'm happy to talk about it to anybody and everybody I meet all the time. You know, I give a talk at garden clubs. I'll give a talk at, universities, so it doesn't matter. It's just getting enough people to think better about the future. I sort of feel like that's the one thing I can uniquely try and do to make the world better.
Where's one of the more interesting places that you've given some of these talks, or a place where maybe you've gone into it and you never thought that this would be the topic of conversation? Maybe you were at the home improvement store or Starbucks, and 15 minutes later, you've blown someone's mind talking about studies of the future. What's one of those stories?
I've never been asked that. I've gone on camping trips with people, and all of a sudden they're like, we're spending an hour, and I feel like, okay, we need to go back to camping. I've talked to a lot of. I'm a big advocate, and I've taught classes actually trying to combine women's studies and futures. How do women look at the future differently than men, which is often the case. And so I've talked to women's groups, and they've come out of there really excited about thinking about the future. And I do, our company does a lot of work with associations, and we've gone into all sorts of associations, from equipment leasing and finance. You wouldn't think, but they're very futures focused. We've worked with the Chemistry Society. We've worked with a lot of different associations and groups, and it's been fun.
It's one thing to do these studies and have these conversations sometimes at very unique places. It's another thing to put together a company that specializes in this work. Can you give us some insight about the development of your organization, Foresight Alliance?
Yeah, there's actually 5 of us, and we're all futurists. 2 of us are professionally trained. My colleague Mark Justman actually was trained at University of Hawaii. And so we bring both University of Hawaii and University of Houston methodologies into it. And the other 3 have done a lot of work in it. And so we do it. We do a lot of what we call environmental scanning for clients, which is looking for the weak signals that are out there so we can understand the indicators of change that are happening for different clients in their domain. And then work with them on understanding what the implications are for them, and how they might respond. What are some of the options for responding? Again, we're looking for alternative futures. There's no one future. So what are like 5 different futures you could respond with?
Wow. I mean, it's so intriguing. I want to dig a little bit deeper on this. Can you give us a story, and sure, you might have to change the names and locations to protect the innocent, but can you give us a story of working with an organization, maybe doing a training session, or maybe with a group of executives, and there might have been some skepticism in the beginning or not, but at the end of your time together, the amount of clarity and synergy and innovation and excitement that came as a result of you really just opening their minds to rethinking how they approach business in the world around them. Can you give us one of those client stories?
We worked with a large food company, which most people would recognize. And we did a lot of work on looking at major trends that were happening that would impact them, and then worked with them on figuring out how to work with their pipeline to prepare for it. And that was very successful. They came back a few years later with a whole bunch of new products that responded to the environment. So that was really exciting. We've worked with just a whole range of different clients. A lot of people, and it's becoming less so, are a little bit scared of saying they're working with a futurist. It feels like, oh, I'm working with a fortune teller, but it's becoming very respectable now. I would go as far as saying, I think there's probably a futurist in most big companies now. And so it's somebody that helps them look at weak signals and options. So you need to find the futurist in your company and work with that. There is a University of Houston offers week-long like executive training to become a futurist, which is You can do, spend a week in Houston and then finish the program remotely. So there's a lot of opportunities and when you're aware that there's a futurist, there's a lot of material to read. There's an association of professional futurists. So there's futurists all around the world in our futurist association. South Africa is a big center of futures.
Wow.
Europe has a big center in futures. Australia is another big center of futures research.
There's a couple of questions that are coming in on our chat, and I want to give you a chance to address some of them. One is Curls of a CPA on YouTube is asking, what's the difference between what your company does and forecasting? Or can you share with us the relationship or even the dichotomy between what you do as a futurist and the idea or principles of forecasting?
Well, we do forecasting. But usually when you work with a client, you have to establish the domain of interest. I mean, otherwise it's unbounded. And, we can live with unbounded, but it means you never get to an answer. So we work with a client to understand first, we call it a domain map, but what is the boundary of areas that they're interested in? How do we get to the real germane parts of what they need to know to do a better job in their area? And then we do research looking for weak signals, looking for trends, looking for where things can happen. And we do forecasting in that area. But I would like to say that there's other things you need to do. A good futurist will not only talk about forecasts, which are the expected future, but at the same time, they talk about the key uncertainties. Those are the known unknowns that need to be considered. And you need to talk about alternative futures, what could happen in addition to the expected futures. And other things like timing, how fast is this forecast and change moving? Where are you in, where it's happening? So there's a lot of other pieces of data that are just as important as forecasts.
In just a few moments ago, when you were talking about working with clients, you mentioned this term that I'm not familiar with, and one of our viewers brought it up as well. Can you define weak signals?
Yeah, good question.
Signals.
Traditionally, we're all trained to never make assumptions unless there's a preponderance of evidence, right? It's like by the time you go to graduate school, your thesis is like, I can cite 50 places that support what I'm doing.
Yeah.
And that's great, but that's analysis. And what we're looking for is weak signals, which is it's showing up one place. It's showing up, we use the term bellwether. So different states have different, might be bellwethers, like Oregon could be a bellwether for environmental movements, different states can be different bellwether, and other countries can be bellwether examples as well. And we look for something you haven't seen a lot of. So a weak signal doesn't have a whole lot of evidence. What that means is it could just, nothing could happen from it, or it could really expand. So we're looking for places where we're not guaranteeing that that'll be what happens, but we're seeing the potential. It's like we're seeing the embryonic state of something and what it could be. And we call it evidence-based creativity, which is we don't make stuff up, but there's the supporting data is very early stages, and we extend what it could be based on, knowledge of how systems work and stuff.
Why is this an experience that really all companies, that all entrepreneurs who are looking, to start a business or expand, or even executives, why does this conversation about futures, why should we be having it on all levels?
Because, and I like to say the difference between futures and strategy, and I've done a lot of strategy in my IBM career too, and I love strategy as well. Futures is about opening up options and looking at what's happening in the outside world and looking at possibilities. So it's very expansive. Strategy is making a decision and making it happen, and it's very analytical, and you need both. So if all you had was futurist, they would be sitting around looking at weak signals for, forever till you told them they had to stop. But when you just jump into strategy, you've limited your options. You're saying, oh, this is the 10 pieces of data I have. Let me make a decision. So you need both. They're complementary. You have to get things done as an organization. You can't just think about things forever, and you've got to have a good strategy. But if you jump into strategy without looking at futures, you haven't looked at all your possibilities, and you haven't understood how the outside world is changing and what that could mean for both your opportunities and risks.
You've had success, tremendous amount of success in so many different areas. And there are times in our professional careers where we'll get a nudge or a pull in a different area. And sometimes we push back against that. What do you say to individuals who are intrigued by your story? They're drawn in and they're thinking, what if I have an interest? What if I've been super successful in this particular area, but there's a part of me that wants to discover something else or investigate, even though there's a possibility I might not have the same amount of success? How did you wrestle with that as you pivoted differently at different stages in your career? And what's your advice to people who may have a nudge to work in a different area?
First of all, if you're good and you have a lot of experience in one area, you can always leverage it in everything you do. I mean, I have leveraged both my experience in IBM and my engineering background a lot as I go into futures. And you might start a lot lower, you have to go through the training, but you build on who you are. And we're very much in today's world an interdisciplinary expertise, right? You're not, you can't become an expert in one little niche while the world's changing. And I think sometimes when you switch to another area, like switching to futures, for me, it recreates who you are. It's invigorating. You get your energy back. I think it's good, and I don't leave anything behind. I mean, I was project manager. I've used all those skills a lot, even as I move into futures, and I've leveraged it to be an advantage in futures, not a negative. So it's made me a better futurist.
At this stage of your amazing career, how long is your future in futures? How much longer do you see yourself doing this and continuing to pour into and inspire the individuals who are coming after you?
I'm headed toward probably getting out of the business world, but not out of the futures world. I'm a board member of the APF. And like I said, you can ask me to do my How to Think Like a Futurist on a moment's notice, and I'll bore you to death. And I promoted it all over. Here's an example. During the pandemic, everybody was locked down, and they asked me to run through my curriculum for our church. So I had 20 people on Zoom once a week that went through the curriculum, not doing the homework, but actually we did week by week until at the end we gave them a little certificate that said they were on board. So I will never stop doing that because it's such an important way to be. But I now have the freedom to do it where I want, how I want, for who I want. So.
Terry, what's the best way to reach out to you, to connect? What if, individuals are intrigued and want to go deeper, or they want to bring you in to consult with or speak to their organization? What's the best way to go about doing that?
My email address is terry.grimm@foresightalliance.com. So you can come contact us at our website. And, we'll be glad to get back with you. Also, if you're interested in just futures as general, go check out the Association of Professional Futurists. There's a lot of resources there. Or University of Houston. Go look at their Studies of the Future program. Those are 3 ways, but I'd love to talk to people that are interested. Like I said, I can talk on a moment's notice. So, email me and we can Skype and have a conversation, or however you want to do it. But I love talking to people that are vested in learning about the future.
I know people are definitely going to reach out to you. I see some questions coming up in the chat as well.
Okay.
Miguel Saran definitely wants to hear about your course. So we'll make sure, Miguel, that you reach out to Terry and get connected. And everyone who's watching us live or watching the replay of this, and you've been deeply intrigued by what Terry has said and her journey, her story, and really just rethinking the possibilities for you or your organization. So Terry, I want to thank you in advance, because I know there are going to be individuals along with Miguel who are going to reach out to you, who are going to get connected. It's going to be a wonderful conversation, and transformation will happen as a result of that. So I thank you in advance for that. And I want to thank you for being such a great guest on Courageous Conversations today.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity.
We'll talk again soon. Okay.
Thank you.